Hello everybody and welcome to Nathan on Shuffle. I've got a really special episode today for you guys. I've got a new album spotlight that I've been excited to talk about. This is one I've kind of been teasing a little bit, especially in my New Music Friday shows. And so today we're going to talk about Glass Hammer and their new album Skallagrim, Into the Breach. I've got the CD right here. This is a really awesome album that I definitely wanted to spotlight. Glass Hammer is a group that I've had a lot of interest in throughout the years. They kind of play that brand of progressive rock that I really love, kind of hearkening back to the symphonic prog of the 70s, very much in the style of Yes and Genesis and Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and all of these kind of stalwarts of the 70s progressive scene. And in this new album, they've really gone into a heavier approach, which is really interesting, and I'm excited to talk about it a bit. But first is a little bit of a background of the group. Glass Hammer is an American progressive rock band that hail from Chattanooga, Tennessee. They formed in 1992. Basically, the kind of main core that's been around since the beginning is Steve Babb and Fred Schindel, who are the primary musicians, songwriters that are kind of multi-instrumentalists. Steve Babb's mostly credited with the bass playing as kind of his primary instrument, and Fred Schindel is mostly the keyboardist of the group. But they do play other instruments, they sing, and they bring on a whole host of other people to kind of add extra elements to the music. They have a very kind of fantasy-inspired aesthetic, I'd say. Basically, their first album was based on Lord of the Rings, called Journey of the Dunedain, based on the story of Aragorn. So really they've had that kind of infused, and they do a lot of concept type work and tell a lot of stories through their music. So if you're a fantasy fan, if you're a symphonic prog fan, this is kind of the perfect marriage of that stuff that I really love. You know, I really have a passion for American progressive rock bands in the new era because, you know, I'm based in the US, and so that has a special closeness to me. But it's cool to see these US bands. When prog in the 70s was kind of more based around the UK and different areas internationally, and kind of the US prog scene was a little bit light. But I like seeing a resurgence of prog in the United States, and so I feel like they're one of the bands that really hold that banner and have that American aesthetic, but bring it into this symphonic progressive rock that was mostly rooted in the UK. So just kind of an aside, something that really draws my attention to them and makes me a big fan. And I've been collecting their albums for quite some time. They have quite a long catalog. They've released about 20 albums at this point, 20 studio albums. And it's expansive. It goes through a lot of different things. They have like a whole host of different vocalists that they've had throughout the years, but they've settled on this new lineup, which is really an exciting one. And this new album really shows them kind of moving in a harder edged, hard rock direction. And one of the notable things about this new configuration of the band is that they have added a female vocalist, Hannah Pryor. This is her first album with the group, and she does an amazing job. She really adds an extra dimension. I feel like they've had a lot of different vocalists throughout the years. That's kind of been the main shift of the group and their sound, is just the different vocalists they've had, you know, from album to album. In fact, you know, they've had several that have stuck around for a few albums, but some that have kind of come and gone. One of my favorite vocalists and one of my favorite periods of the group was John Davison, who's now the frontman of Yes and has a lot of great feature on the latest Yes album, The Quest. He was with the group for quite some time, notably in this period. If, Corcordium, and Perilous were kind of the three main albums that he was the featured vocalist for. And that's kind of my favored period of the group. That's where I kind of came on board and really discovered and loved this group. And they've released several albums since those. And they seemingly release an album every year or two. And so they're very prolific, and they have a lot of content, and they have that kind of core base in that 70s prog, but they add different kind of elements to it, some modern elements, some heavier metal elements, and they kind of mix it into their melting pot, and it creates for a fascinating stew of music. The last album they released was Dreaming City in 2020, which is actually the first part of this planned trilogy of albums that tells this continuous story. This is actually the second album in that series. So that this album is Skallagrim, Into the Breach. And the story, it's based on kind of a sword and sorcery type novel, high fantasy. In fact, it sounds like Steve Babb is actually writing a fantasy based on this. He's in the midst of that, penning his own novel, Skallagrim in the Valley of Pagarna. So that should be published maybe as soon as next year. He's working on that one. I heard an interview that they did with the Prog Report, so that kind of revealed some details. I recommend checking that out if you want to hear more about that. But really exciting because I'm a fantasy guy. I really love fantasy novels, so it's kind of cool that these two worlds are colliding. My love of literature and fantasy novels, and then my love of progressive rock. And so because this is kind of the second part, this is kind of the character kind of going to war in essence, which is why the music is so much heavier. And so that kind of, the music kind of typifies the story and the direction that it's taking. So basically kind of a brief explanation of the narrative between Dreaming City and to this one. The narrative follows the thief Skallagrim, armed with his screaming sword Terminus, leaving Archon, which is the Dreaming City from that first album, to travel to savage and magical lands in search of his memories in the hope of finding the girl he has loved and lost. And so this album kind of is that quest to find this lost love and the protagonist going to war. And so it's very dark, heavy, and angrier than I'd say the previous album was. The previous album kind of started going in this direction of kind of this Rush-inspired, harder rock kind of sound that was a little bit distinct from their previous albums. But this one kind of fully embraces it even further, I would say, and really kind of ramps up the darkness, the heaviness to another degree. And it's not like it's like all of a sudden they're becoming a progressive metal, like Dream Theater-esque group. This is still rooted in kind of that 70s aesthetic, and there's definitely lots of symphonic prog keyboards and sections that sound like, Yes and Gentle Giant and those kind of classic bands, ELP. But there's a harder edge, kind of more like the hard rock sound of the 70s, like a early Black Sabbath or like a Deep Purple perhaps in sections, or like Rush in their harder edged phase. That is kind of the sound you could expect here, and I think it really brings a cool dimension to the music, because their previous albums, as much as I love the symphonic prog and their Yes influences and stuff, sometimes I wished for a bit more of an edge to their music that I think would add a great element that would kind of give me more to grab onto and to really sink my teeth into, and I think that's what they've accomplished here. And adding on the secret sauce of Hannah Pryor as a vocalist, she's a fabulous vocalist, and it really comes across in these tracks. She's featured on several of them. When her voice comes through, that's, to me, the highlights of the album that I really appreciate. And she really starts this off. There's a kind of a shorter intro track called He's Got a Girl, which introduces kind of this gentle piano with Hannah Pryor's vocals on top, kind of this atmospheric lead-in before we get to Anthem to Outeroth, which is like heavy, in-your-face, riff-driven, almost metal song that really allows Hannah Pryor to kind of sing to the heavens and really use that forceful, powerful voice of hers. And I think it really works. And this is really a great introduction to that heavier sound I've been mentioning. This moves into Sellsword, which is one of my favorites. I really love this track. It kind of continues that heavy sound with some Sabbath-style guitar and some great keyboards, 70s hard rock sound, some heavy organ. There's a few spacier sections to kind of really round it out, but really it's mostly riff-driven and really a hard rocker, which I really like and think it sounds great. Next, we move to Steel, Flicus Major. A really great track that features Hannah Pryor's vocals once again. Great keyboard work is highlighted on this one. Maybe one of the more proggier tracks with some of that harder edge, but not overwhelmingly so. Cool instrumental break in the middle. That's where I kind of hear that Gentle Giant type influence. There's kind of this medieval Renaissance type section that's very brief, but a really cool nod there, and I really love that. Then we move into this kind of instrumental section of the album. There's 3 tracks in a row that are instrumentals that kind of veer more towards kind of the atmospheric side of the group. The first one, A Spell Upon His Mind, really almost brings in this kind of electronica type element with pulsating keyboards and haunting guitar sounds. Really dreamy and spacey, and kind of a cool break from that heaviness that kind of really hits you over the head in those first few tracks. Moonpool kind of brings in a jazzier influence with some bass and drum sounds and more spacey guitar and keyboards around it. The Dark is kind of where we get back into this heavier, darker sound that leads back to kind of our darker themes with dark atmospheres and guitar over kind of a Hammond organ sound. So that leads into a couple tracks here, vocal tracks, but not with Hannah Pryor. She kind of takes a break from the album a little bit here, and the Steve Babb kind of takes over vocals here in The Ogre of Arkon. And this is another heavier driving track with a very galloping kind of bass line. To me, there's parts of it, like I mentioned earlier, that sound like Deep Purple, especially when there's some organ that kind of comes in towards the second half of the song. But there's a lot of cool stuff going on here in the music, and Into the Breach kind of continues with that 70s rock vibe and Hammond organ. Great soloing with keyboards and guitars. I don't think Steve Babb and Fred Schindel, who do some of the vocals at times, they're good at what they do, but they're not the most powerful vocalists in the world. So I think that's why they tend to kind of push the vocals towards other players. They kind of bring on other vocalists to kind of help them out. So the vocals are not as strong here, but they're serviceable, and I think the music behind it is so strong and so driving that it really works just fine, and it really continues the music along on a great path. But then it comes back to Hannah Pryor's vocals with The Forlorn Hope, which is really a highlight, again, of the album. Really, really great heavy music to start, but then there's kind of an acoustic guitar and pastoral section that comes about halfway through with this kind of dream on vocal refrain. Nice contrast to the heaviness, a great vocal moment where Hannah Pryor really gets to shine and show her kind of angelic side to her vocals. Because what's really cool about her voice is she has the power and the drive to lead these heavy, rockier sections, but she also has the angelic, nicer, prettier vocals that can come about in these more prettier sections that happen on the album. So, and those are really highlighted in a great way. Writing on the Wall continues along kind of the heavier vein with some funkiness almost in the tempo that is carrying forward. Great vocals that build in intensity, and some great keyboards once again that kind of take center stage towards the end and kind of have this ELP inspired sound. This leads to the biggest Rush influence of the album to me, Hyperborea, which is like classic Rush, kind of in that late 70s, early 80s period. There's times where it kind of reminds me of like the sound of Xanadu or something off of like Hemispheres or Farewell to Kings. But then there's also bits that are a bit more kind of in the moving pictures, kind of Tom Sawyer vein with some synthesizers and some of that kind of almost 80s inspired Rush sound. So I think this really runs the gamut of kind of my favorite period of Rush, with Hannah Pryor's great vocals on top of it. So really great feature. I really love this track. I think it's another highlight. And I keep saying all these tracks are highlights, but they are. It's a really cool album that has so many highlights, and then it ends with kind of a musical coda towards the end that just wraps the whole story up for this installment, leads you towards what's to come in part 3. So really, really amazing album by the group. I think they've really outdone themselves here. This is one of my favorite albums by them, I think. I've been listening to it a lot over the past week and a half or so, and it just gets better and better with each listen, which to me is the hallmark of a great prog album, that it's fun at first listen, but there's so much going on that you have to keep listening to really grab hold of all these different elements, and it just keeps growing and keeps revealing itself in new and extra layers as you keep listening. So there's a lot to really love, and so I highly recommend this album. I think it's really strong, one of the best by the band. I think this heavier direction really is a plus for them. I think it really brought a great element, and it does a great job for the storytelling. It kind of really explores this darker, heavier side that I think really works in the context of the story. There's kind of this middle section that the instrumentals, as good as I think they are, sometimes I feel like my mind wanders a bit too much during some of that, because there's quite a bit of it. So maybe I'd cut that down, or maybe spread those out a little bit differently, but it's a minor concern. And maybe I'd have Hannah Pryor's vocals even more so on more tracks, or brought in another vocalist for some of that midsection where she's kind of absent. But those are minor things, because it's really strong, and the music itself is just really great and well crafted. And so this is just a highly recommended album that I hope you guys check out. Please go to their website. You can order the album there. You can order a digital download. You can order it on CD. There's different bundles. You know, I'm not sure what's being offered anymore. I know there was a lot of pre-order stuff, but I'm certain that there's ways you can order the album there, you know. So please check it out if you're a fan like me of great quality American progressive rock, based kind of in that sound of the 70s with a little bit of a harder edge to it. So thank you guys so much for watching this. Thank you guys for supporting my channel. Grateful for all my subscribers, and I hope you guys appreciate my recommendations and my discussions on these albums, because that's what I'm really trying to do. I'm not really a critic, as I say a lot. You know, I don't like to analyze and tear apart music. You know, I just like to discover great music and share it with you guys when I think it's worth sharing, and I think this is definitely worth sharing. So thank you guys so much. Please subscribe if you haven't yet. I'd appreciate it. I'm trying to grow the channel. I think it's doing really well. I'm really proud of the direction it's heading. Please give your thoughts on Glass Hammer in the comments. If you've heard this album, how do you feel about it? What's your favorite tracks? So thank you guys again, and you guys are really great, and I'm really appreciative. So thank you guys so much, and I hope to see you guys in a future video. So bye.